The Sunday family gathering began like countless others before it, with laughter echoing through the spacious dining room of the Chen family home, and every conversation somehow revolving around Sarah. The large colonial-style house was packed with relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents filling every seat around the long dining table. The smell of home-cooked food drifted through the air, while glasses clinked and voices overlapped in cheerful celebration. At the center of it all sat Sarah, glowing with confidence as the sparkling diamond engagement ring on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight. Every few minutes, someone complimented her, congratulated her, or asked another question about the upcoming wedding. Sarah smiled graciously at the attention she had grown accustomed to receiving her entire life. At the far end of the table sat Emily, quiet and almost invisible. While Sarah had always been the pride of the family, Emily had spent years living in her shadow. Growing up, every achievement Emily earned seemed to be compared to something Sarah had done first or done better. If Emily brought home excellent grades, Sarah's accomplishments were considered more impressive. If Emily worked hard toward a goal, her efforts were dismissed as expected rather than celebrated. Over time, Emily stopped trying to compete for attention because she had learned that no matter what she achieved, she would never be enough in her family's eyes. They rarely asked about her life, her career, or her dreams. They had already decided who she was, the less successful daughter. As the afternoon continued, the conversation shifted once again to the Thornton family. Emily's father could barely contain his excitement as he described Sarah's future in-laws. To him, the Thorntons represented everything he admired: wealth, influence, prestige, and power. Marcus Thornton's father was a United States senator, and that fact alone seemed to elevate Sarah's engagement into something almost royal. Her father proudly spoke about the luxurious estate, where the wedding would take place, the hundreds of distinguished guests expected to attend, and the possibility that politicians, business leaders, and celebrities might be present. Every word carried the same message: Sarah had secured a future among people who mattered. The more they praised the Thorntons, the more uncomfortable Emily became. She listened quietly as her parents discussed social status and appearances as though they were the most important things in life. To them, success was measured by wealth, powerful connections, and public recognition. They never talked about kindness, sacrifice, or service to others. They never spoke about character. Emily lowered her eyes to her plate, hoping to avoid becoming part of the conversation. Unfortunately, that hope did not last long. Suddenly, her father placed his fork down and announced that there was something important the family needed to discuss. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. Then he looked directly at Emily. What followed was a moment she would never forget. In a calm but cold voice, he explained that Sarah's wedding was extremely important and that the Thornton family expected a certain image from those attending. He spoke about sophistication, influence, and social standing before finally arriving at the point he truly wanted to make. According to him, Emily simply did not belong. The words struck like a slap across the face. Her father openly suggested that Emily would embarrass the family in front of the Thorntons. He pointed to her modest apartment, her old car, and what he assumed was an unremarkable career. He implied that she lacked the success and refinement required to attend such an exclusive event. Rather than defending her, Emily's mother attempted to soften the cruelty by framing it as a practical decision. Sarah, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge her parents, remained silent. Her silence hurt almost as much as the insult itself. Around the table, the extended family avoided eye contact. Some stared at their plates, while others suddenly found their drinks fascinating. No one spoke up. No one objected. No one reminded Emily's parents that families should stand together regardless of wealth or status. Their silence became its own form of betrayal. In that moment, Emily realized she was completely alone. When she finally asked whether she was truly being excluded from her own sister's wedding, her father's answer was immediate. He insisted it was for the best. According to him, she would feel uncomfortable around successful people anyway. The statement revealed exactly how little he understood his daughter. He had spent so many years judging her based on appearances that he never bothered to learn who she really was. A deep ache settled in Emily's chest. The humiliation was overwhelming, yet she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She remained calm, even as anger and heartbreak battled inside her. Looking around the room one final time, she saw a family that valued status more than loyalty and appearances more than love. For years, she had hoped they would eventually see her worth. For years, she had believed that if she worked hard enough, they might finally appreciate her. Now she understood the truth. Nothing she did would ever be enough because they were measuring her value with the wrong standards. Still, despite the pain, Emily said very little. She held her composure while everyone else revealed their true character. The dinner that had begun as a celebration ended with a wound that would change her relationship with her family forever. As she quietly prepared to leave, none of them realized that the woman they had just dismissed as insignificant was hiding a truth so extraordinary that it would soon turn their entire world upside down. For a few long seconds after her father's cruel words echoed through the dining room, Emily sat perfectly still. The humiliation was almost unbearable. 23 members of her family surrounded her, yet not a single person had defended her. They had listened as her father dismissed her as a failure, as someone unworthy of attending her own sister's wedding, and they had remained silent. Something inside her finally snapped. For years, she had swallowed every insult, ignored every comparison, and accepted every unfair judgment. But this time was different. This time she was tired of shrinking herself to make other people comfortable. When Emily finally spoke, her voice sounded different. It was calm, steady, and confident in a way her family had never heard before. There was no hesitation, no apology, and no trace of the timid woman they thought they knew. "I'm a pediatric cardiac surgeon," she said. Her father barely looked up. "Yes, you've mentioned that." "No," Emily replied. "You heard the words, but you never actually listened." The room grew quiet. Emily slowly set down her fork and looked around the table. For the first time in years, every eye was focused on her. "I'm not just a doctor who works at a hospital. I'm the chief of pediatric cardiac surgery at Mount Sinai." The silence became immediate and absolute. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. Her father frowned as though he had misheard her. "What did you say?" he asked. Emily met his gaze without flinching. "I lead one of the most respected pediatric cardiac surgery departments in the country. I specialize in complex congenital heart defects. I've performed more than 2,400 successful heart surgeries on children. Many of those children wouldn't be alive today if my team and I hadn't operated." The color slowly drained from her mother's face. Sarah stared at her as though she were looking at a stranger. Emily continued, "My research has been published in some of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. I lecture at medical conferences. I train surgeons. Hospitals consult me on difficult cases." The room remained frozen. Every word felt like another crack forming in the image her family had created of her. Her father laughed nervously. "That's impossible." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Why?" "Because if any of that were true, we would know." The statement almost made her laugh. For years, they had assumed they knew everything about her while never bothering to ask a single meaningful question. "You would know," Emily said quietly, "if you had ever cared enough to find out." The words landed like a punch. Her mother looked stunned. "Emily, why didn't you tell us?" Emily couldn't help noticing the irony. "I did tell you. Every time you asked what I did, I said I worked at Mount Sinai Hospital." "That's not the same thing," Sarah interrupted. "No," Emily asked. "You never said you were famous." The accusation hung in the air. Emily shook her head. "I never wanted to be famous." She reached into her purse and pulled out her hospital identification card. One by one, family members leaned forward to look. The badge clearly displayed her name, her title, and her position. Chief of Pediatric Cardiac Surgery. Her father's hands trembled slightly as he stared at it. For the first time all afternoon, he had nothing to say. Sarah grabbed the card next. Her eyes moved repeatedly over the title as though she hoped it would somehow change. A strange mixture of disbelief and jealousy flickered across her face. All her life, she had been the successful daughter, the accomplished one, the family star. Now she was discovering that her quiet younger sister had built an extraordinary career while receiving none of the recognition she herself constantly demanded. "You make it sound like you're some kind of celebrity surgeon," Sarah muttered. Emily shrugged. "I save children's lives." No one spoke. The simplicity of the statement made it even more powerful. She wasn't talking about stock portfolios, political connections, or social status. She was talking about children who had been given a chance to grow up because of her work. Finally, her father found his voice. "If you're really so successful, then why do you live in that tiny apartment? Why do you drive that old car?" Emily almost smiled, because at last he had revealed what truly mattered to him. Money, appearances, status, the things he had always valued above everything else. "I live close to the hospital because my patients matter more than commuting from a luxury neighborhood," she said. "I drive an old car because it works perfectly fine." She paused. "And because I don't need expensive things to prove my worth." Several relatives lowered their eyes. Emily continued. I donate a large portion of my income to children's charities. More silence. I help fund medical research. No one moved. And I spent years paying off student loans because becoming a surgeon wasn't handed to me. The entire room seemed smaller now. The people who had spent years judging her suddenly looked uncomfortable, not because she had become someone different, but because they had finally realized how wrong they had been. Her mother wiped tears from her eyes. Why would you hide all of this from us? Emily looked around the table, at her father, at Sarah, at the relatives who had watched her humiliation without saying a word. Then she gave the answer she had carried inside her for years. Because I wanted to know if I was enough without it. The room fell silent once again. I wanted to know if my family would love me even if I wasn't rich, even if I wasn't famous, even if I wasn't impressive. Her voice softened. I wanted to know if being Emily was enough. No one could meet her eyes. Because everyone knew the answer. Her father had just excluded her from a wedding because he believed she wasn't important enough. Her mother had supported him. Sarah had stayed silent. And the rest of the family had watched. The truth was impossible to deny. For them, love had conditions. Respect had condition. Acceptance had conditions. Emily stood from her chair. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silent room. No one tried to stop her. No one knew what to say. For the first time in years, the balance of power had completely shifted. The woman they had dismissed as insignificant had become the most accomplished person in the room. Yet somehow that victory didn't feel satisfying. It only felt sad. Because she had never wanted their admiration. She had wanted their love. And there was a difference. Picking up her purse, she glanced around the table one final time. I hope the wedding is everything you wanted, she said quietly. Then she turned and walked away. Behind her, chaos immediately erupted. Her mother called her name. Sarah stood from her chair. Her father demanded that she come back. But Emily kept walking. She stepped out of the house and into the cool evening air, feeling strangely calm. For the first time in years, she had told the truth. The entire truth. And now her family was finally seeing her for who she really was. Unfortunately for them, it was already too late. That night, her phone rang again and again. Her father called. Her mother called. Sarah called. Text messages flooded in. Question. Apologies. Excuses. Demol. Emily ignored every single one. As she blocked, each number panic began spreading through the family she had left behind. The daughter they had spent years overlooking had suddenly become impossible to ignore, and none of them yet realized that this was only the beginning of a much bigger reckoning waiting just around the corner. The weeks following that disastrous family dinner were strangely peaceful for Emily. After years of trying to earn the approval of people who seemed determined not to give it, she had finally stopped trying. She blocked her parents' phone numbers. She ignored Sarah's messages. She deleted every email that arrived with an apology attached to it. At first, the silence felt painful. Then it became liberating. Without the constant weight of family expectations hanging over her shoulders, Emily threw herself completely into her work. The hospital became her world. Long before sunrise each morning, she was already reviewing patient charts, studying scans, and preparing for surgeries that would determine whether children lived or died. While her family obsessed over wedding invitations, guest lists, and social status, Emily focused on things that truly mattered. Tiny hearts, fragile lives, terrified parents praying for miracles. Every successful surgery reminded her why she had chosen this path. Every child discharged from the hospital gave her a sense of purpose that no amount of wealth or prestige could ever match. One afternoon, after completing a particularly difficult procedure on a 2-year-old patient, Emily sat alone in the surgeon's lounge, exhausted. Her mentor, Dr. Patricia Williams, noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the sadness she was trying so hard to hide. "You've been carrying something heavy," Patricia said gently. Emily hesitated before finally telling her everything. The wedding. The humiliation. The rejection. Patricia listened quietly until the story was finished. When Emily finally stopped speaking, the older surgeon shook her head in disbelief. "Your family has no idea who you are, do they?" Emily managed a weak smile. "Apparently not." Patricia leaned forward. "One day they'll understand what they lost." Emily wasn't so sure. And honestly, she no longer cared. As spring turned into summer, Sarah's wedding drew closer. The date was now only days away. Family members continued trying to contact her, but Emily had already made her decision. She would not attend. No amount of apologies could erase what had happened. No amount of guilt could force her to sit among people who had measured her worth by her bank account and address. Instead, she volunteered to work that weekend. If the wedding happened without her, so be it. She had patients who needed her far more than her family did. The morning of the wedding weekend arrived like any other. Emily spent most of Saturday at Mount Sinai Hospital. She completed 2 successful surgeries and finished rounds shortly before evening. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax. Back at her apartment in Queens, she changed into comfortable clothes, ordered takeout, and settled onto her couch with a documentary playing softly in the background. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. Emily almost ignored it. Almost. Something made her answer. Hello. The voice on the other end sounded terrified. Dr. Chen. Yes. This is Catherine Thornton. Emily sat upright immediately. The name was impossible to miss. Catherine Thornton, mother of Marcus Thornton, future mother-in-law of Sarah, the woman whose family had been considered so important that Emily had been excluded from the wedding. Catherine's voice trembled. Dr. Chen, I need your help. Emily instantly shifted into professional mode. What's happened? My grandson Charlie collapsed during the rehearsal dinner. The words came out between sobs. We rushed him to the hospital. The doctors discovered a severe congenital heart defect. They said he needs emergency surgery immediately. Emily's pulse quickened. What diagnosis? Catherine began reading from medical notes. As the details emerged, Emily's expression grew more serious. The condition was devastating. A complex congenital defect involving major arterial abnormalities and a dangerous ventricular defect. Without surgery, the child could die. And quickly. The doctors here said they can't perform the procedure, Catherine whispered. They said the best surgeon in the region is at Mount Sinai. Emily already knew where this was going. And they told you my name. Yes. The woman broke down completely. Please, Dr. Chen. He's only 3 years old. For a moment, Emily closed her eyes. A child was fighting for his life. Nothing else mattered. Not Sarah. Not her parents. Not the wedding. Not the humiliation. A little boy needed help. And helping children was what she did. Transfer him immediately, Emily said firmly. I'm heading to the hospital now. The relief in Catherine's voice was immediate. Thank you so much. 45 minutes later, Emily stood inside Mount Sinai reviewing Charlie's scans. The situation was worse than expected. The anatomy of his heart was unusually complicated. Several structures were malformed. Blood flow was dangerously compromised. Without intervention, survival was unlikely. Even with surgery, the risks were enormous. Most surgeons would hesitate. Emily didn't. This was exactly the type of case she had spent her career mastering. By the time Charlie arrived, an entire surgical team was waiting. The atmosphere inside the operating suite felt electric. Every member of the staff understood the stakes. One mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of hesitation, and a 3-year-old child would never wake up. Outside the operating room, Catherine Thornton waited with her husband, Senator Richard Thornton, and Charlie's parents. Fear had stripped away every trace of status and influence. There were no senators, no wealthy elites, no important families. Only terrified grandparents and parents desperate to save a child they loved. Before entering surgery, Emily met them briefly. Catherine's eyes were swollen from crying. Richard Thornton looked exhausted. Neither cared about titles or social standing anymore. They cared about one thing. Charlie. Can you save him? Catherine asked. Emily didn't offer false promises. She never did. I will do everything possible. The answer was enough. Hours later, the surgery began. The operating room became a world of intense concentration. Monitors beeped steadily. Machines breathed for Charlie while his tiny heart rested motionless in Emily's hands. Every movement required absolute precision. The room remained silent except for medical instructions and vital updates. Sweat formed beneath Emily's surgical cap. Her shoulders ached. Her eyes never left the tiny heart before her. One wrong stitch could end everything. Time seemed to lose meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like minutes. Outside, Charlie's family sat in agonizing uncertainty. Inside, Emily fought for a life. At one particularly difficult moment, a complication threatened to derail the entire procedure. Blood flow measurements dropped unexpectedly. Several members of the surgical team exchanged worried looks. The tension became suffocating. For a few terrifying seconds, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Emily saw the problem. Calmly, she adjusted the repair. The monitors responded. Vital signs improved. The crisis passed. Nobody spoke, but everyone in the room understood what had just happened. A lesser surgeon might have lost the patient. Emily didn't. Hour after hour, she continued working. Carefully, patiently, relentlessly. Finally, as dawn approached, the last repair was completed. The heart began beating normally. Strong, steady, alive. The entire operating room seemed to exhale at once. A nurse quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Another surgeon smiled in relief. Emily looked at the monitor one final time before speaking. He's going to make it. The words felt almost magical. Because they were true. Several hours later, Emily walked into the waiting area. The Thornton family immediately stood. Catherine looked terrified. Richard gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Charlie's parents looked as though they hadn't breathed all night. Emily smiled. A simple smile. But it told them everything. The surgery was successful. Catherine burst into tears. Charlie's mother collapsed into her husband's arms. Richard Thornton lowered his head and covered his eyes. For the first time, all night hope returned. Emily explained the procedure, the recovery process, and what to expect over the coming days. The family listened to every word. When she finished, Catherine suddenly took both of Emily's hands. Her voice shook with emotion. "You saved my grandson." Emily offered a small smile. "I did my job." "No," Richard Thornton said quietly. "You did much more than that." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Catherine looked directly into Emily's eyes. There was no social status, no political influence, no wealth, only gratitude, pure and genuine, the kind Emily had rarely experienced from her own family. "You gave our family a future," Catherine whispered. "We will never forget that." At that moment, Emily didn't know that the child she had just saved would change her own future as well. She didn't know that within hours she would walk into the very wedding she had been excluded from. She didn't know that the same people who had called her unworthy were about to discover exactly who she was. All she knew was that Charlie Thornton was alive. A little boy would get to grow up. A family would get to keep their child. And once again, Emily had proven something her parents had never understood. True worth is not measured by wealth status or powerful connections. It is measured by the lives you touch and the difference you make when it matters most. After nearly 24 hours without sleep, Emily should have gone home and rested. The emergency surgery had pushed her to her physical limits, and every muscle in her body ached from standing in the operating room for hours. Yet as she prepared to leave Mount Sinai Hospital, Catherine Thornton stopped her in the hallway. The older woman's eyes were still red from crying, but now they shone with relief and gratitude. "Dr. Chen," she said softly, "our family would be honored if you joined us at the wedding today." Emily froze. For a moment she thought she had misheard. The wedding. Sarah's wedding. The very event she had been told she wasn't worthy of attending. The invitation felt almost surreal. She should have declined. Every logical part of her mind told her to go home, sleep, and leave the past behind. But another part of her, the part that was tired of hiding, tired of shrinking herself, tired of carrying the burden of other people's judgments, whispered something different. Maybe it was time. Not for revenge. Not for humiliation. Simply for the truth. A few hours later, after showering and changing into a simple navy blue dress, Emily drove to the Thornton estate in Greenwich. The property looked exactly as she had imagined. Elegant gardens stretched across acres of perfectly maintained grounds. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance. Guests in designer clothing moved between white tents and beautifully decorated reception areas. Everything radiated wealth, influence, and status. The very things her family had worshipped. As Emily stepped from her car, she felt a strange sense of calm. For once, she had nothing to prove. She wasn't there seeking approval. She wasn't there trying to impress anyone. She was there because she had saved a child's life. Nothing else mattered. A member of the staff escorted her toward the brunch gathering where wedding guests had begun arriving. The moment Emily stepped onto the terrace, time seemed to stop. Her mother saw her first. The color drained from her face instantly. The glass in her hand nearly slipped from her fingers. Across the table, her father turned to see what had startled her. His expression froze. Completely. It was as if he had seen a ghost. Then Sarah looked up. For a split second, confusion crossed her face. Then disbelief. Then panic. Her eyes widened so dramatically that she looked as though she might faint. Emily could almost hear the thoughts racing through her sister's mind. What is she doing here? How did she get here? Who invited her? For several seconds, nobody spoke. The entire family simply stared. Before any of them could react, a cheerful voice broke the silence. Dr. Chen. Catherine Thornton practically rushed across the terrace toward her. The moment she reached Emily, she wrapped both hands around hers and smiled warmly. I'm so happy you came. Emily smiled politely. Thank you for inviting me. What happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments of Emily's life. Catherine turned toward the crowd and raised her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have everyone's attention? Conversations immediately stopped. Dozens of guests turned toward her. The terrace fell silent. Standing beside Emily, Catherine smiled proudly. I would like to introduce someone very special. She paused dramatically. This is Dr. Emily Chen. A few guests nodded politely. Then Catherine continued. The woman standing beside me spent 6 hours last night saving my grandson's life. The silence shattered. Gasps spread through the crowd. Every eye immediately turned toward Emily. Catherine's voice trembled with emotion. Charlie would not be alive today if it weren't for her extraordinary skill, dedication, and compassion. The room erupted into applause. People stood. Not just a few. Everyone. More than 50 guests rose to their feet. The sound filled the terrace. Emily stood frozen. She wasn't accustomed to public recognition. She had spent most of her life avoiding attention. Yet here she was receiving a standing ovation from complete strangers. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her family's faces. Their expressions were unforgettable. Her father looked physically ill. His jaw hung slightly open. His face had gone pale. For the first time in his life, he seemed to have no words. Her mother had tears streaming down her cheeks. Not gentle tears. The kind that come when a person suddenly realizes the full weight of their mistakes. And Sarah looked terrified. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Terrified. Because she was beginning to understand something devastating. The sister she had spent years looking down on had just become the most admired person at her own wedding. The applause finally faded. Then Senator Richard Thornton stepped forward holding a champagne glass. The powerful politician surveyed the crowd before speaking. I've met presidents. The guests laughed softly. I've met governors, CEOs, world leaders, and some of the most influential people in the country. He paused. But last night I met a hero. The crowd became silent again. Richard looked directly at Emily. My grandson is alive because of this woman. Emotion cracked his normally commanding voice. While most people were sleeping, Dr. Chen spent the entire night fighting for a child's future. He raised his glass. To Dr. Emily Chen. Everyone followed. To Dr. Emily Chen. The toast echoed across the terrace. More applause followed. This time even louder than before. Emily noticed Marcus staring at her with obvious recognition. Eventually, he turned toward Sarah. Wait. His voice was filled with confusion. Your sister is Dr. Emily Chen. Sarah swallowed hard. Yes. Marcus looked stunned. The Dr. Emily Chen. The emphasis on the word that changed everything. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. Emily Chen is one of the most respected pediatric cardiac surgeons in New York. Several guests nearby nodded immediately. One woman mentioned reading about Emily's groundbreaking research. Another talked about a conference where she had been the keynote speaker. A third guest praised her surgical innovations. The discussion spread rapidly. Within minutes, it became painfully obvious. The Thornton family knew exactly who Emily was. Many of their guests knew who Emily was. Leaders in medicine knew who Emily was. People throughout New York knew who Emily was. The only people who hadn't bothered to learn were her own family. That realization hit like a hammer. Her father lowered his eyes. Her mother covered her mouth. Sarah looked as though she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. Then came the final blow. Catherine personally escorted Emily to the head table. Not a side table. Not a guest table. The head table. The place reserved for the most important people at the wedding. Emily found herself seated beside Senator Thornton and other honored guests. Meanwhile, her parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins sat several tables away among ordinary attendees. The contrast was impossible to ignore. 3 months earlier, they had declared she wasn't important enough to attend. Now she occupied a seat of honor while they watched from a distance. Throughout the afternoon, guests continued approaching Emily. Doctors wanted to speak with her. Business leaders thanked her. Parents shared stories about children she had inspired. Politicians asked for her opinion on healthcare policy. Every conversation reinforced the same truth. Emily's value had never depended on wealth, appearances, or social connections. Her value came from her character, from her sacrifice, from the thousands of lives she had touched. And the most beautiful part of all, she had never needed to tell anyone. Her work spoke for itself. Across the room, her family sat trapped with their own thoughts. For years, they had judged Emily by her apartment, her car, her clothing, and her quiet personality. Now they were being forced to confront a reality they could no longer deny. They had been wrong. Spectacularly wrong. Not because Emily was successful, not because she was famous, but because they had never bothered to see her as a person. For the first time in their lives, they were experiencing exactly what Emily had felt for years: the pain of being judged without being understood. The difference was that Emily had suffered in silence. Their humiliation was happening in front of hundreds of witnesses. And as Emily sat calmly among people who genuinely appreciated her, she realized something important. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't victory. This was simply the truth finally revealing itself. And sometimes the truth is more powerful than any revenge could ever be. The days following Sarah's wedding were some of the strangest Emily had ever experienced. For years, she had been invisible to her family. Now suddenly she was all they could talk about. Her phone rang constantly. Her father called. Her mother called. Sarah called. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and even distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years began reaching out. At first, the messages sounded sincere. "We're sorry. We made a mistake. Please give us another chance. We miss you." But as the days turned into weeks, Emily began noticing a pattern. Many of the apologies weren't really about her. They were about what she could do for them. One cousin wanted medical advice. An aunt asked if Emily could help her husband join a research study. Another relative wanted an introduction to a hospital administrator. Even her father couldn't resist mentioning how proud people would be to learn there was a famous surgeon in the family. It hurt. Not because they were asking for favors, but because it confirmed what Emily had feared all along. Most of them still didn't understand. They hadn't suddenly discovered her value. They had discovered her status. And to them, those were not the same thing. As a result, Emily kept her distance. She didn't answer the calls. She ignored most of the emails. She politely declined invitations to family gatherings. For the first time in her life, she stopped chasing acceptance. And strangely enough, she had never felt more free. While her biological family struggled to rebuild a relationship with her, another connection was quietly growing stronger. Catherine Thornton. What had started as gratitude after Charlie's surgery slowly developed into something neither woman had expected. Friendship. Real friendship. The kind built on honesty rather than obligation. The kind built on mutual respect rather than expectations. Catherine invited Emily to lunch. Then to charity events. Then to dinners with close friends. Unlike Emily's parents, Catherine never cared about titles or achievements. When they talked, they discussed books, travel, family hopes, fears, and life. For the first time in years, Emily found herself opening up to someone. One afternoon, while sitting together in Catherine's garden, the older woman asked a question no one in Emily's family had ever bothered to ask. "Are you happy?" The simplicity of the question caught Emily off guard. Nobody had ever asked. Not her parents. Not Sarah. Not any of her relatives. They had always asked what she accomplished, never how she felt. Emily thought about it carefully before answering. "More than I used to be." Catherine smiled. "Good, you deserve that." In many ways, Catherine became the mother figure Emily had spent her entire life searching for. Not because she tried to replace her mother, but because she offered something Emily had rarely experienced: unconditional support. Months passed. Charlie continued to recover beautifully. Every follow-up appointment brought more good news. The once fragile little boy was now running, laughing, and living the childhood he almost lost. Whenever he saw Emily, he greeted her with the same enthusiastic smile. To him, she wasn't a famous surgeon. She wasn't an award-winning doctor. She was simply the person who had helped him. And somehow that meant more than any title ever could. Meanwhile, Sarah's life was changing in unexpected ways. Unlike the rest of the family, she eventually stopped trying to defend what had happened. Instead, she started asking difficult questions. Questions about herself. Questions about her parents. Questions about the values she had spent her entire life pursuing. For years, Sarah had measured success exactly the way her parents had taught her. Status. Prestige. Appearance. Approval. But seeing Emily at the wedding had shattered that belief system. The woman their parents had considered a disappointment was actually saving children's lives. The woman they had judged as unsuccessful had built a career that genuinely changed the world. It forced Sarah to confront an uncomfortable truth. She had spent most of her life chasing validation. Emily had spent hers creating meaning. The difference was impossible to ignore. Eventually, Sarah began therapy. At first, Emily was skeptical. She assumed it was just another attempt to repair her image. But over time, the emails Sarah sent started feeling different. More honest. More vulnerable. Less defensive. She admitted her mistakes. She acknowledged her jealousy. She confessed how much of her life had been driven by fear of disappointing their parents. Most importantly, she stopped asking for forgiveness. Instead, she focused on becoming someone worthy of it. That was when Emily finally responded. Not with complete forgiveness. Not yet. But with a willingness to talk. A willingness to listen. A willingness to try. Their relationship rebuilt slowly. Carefully. Like repairing something fragile after years of damage. And while it was never perfect, it became real. Far more real than it had ever been before. As the years passed, Emily's career continued reaching new heights. Her research transformed pediatric cardiac surgery. Hospitals around the world adopted techniques she helped develop. Medical journals published her work. International conferences invited her to speak. Eventually, she received one of the highest honors in her field, a National Lifetime Achievement Award. At only 37 years old, she became the youngest recipient in the history of the organization. The ceremony attracted hundreds of surgeons, researchers, and healthcare leaders from across the country. As Emily stood on stage accepting the award, she looked out across the audience. Among the faces she recognized were Catherine Thornton, Richard Thornton, Charlie, Sarah, and in the back row, her parents. After the ceremony, her father approached her. The years had changed him. He looked older, smaller somehow, less certain than before. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I'm proud of you." Emily studied his face carefully. The words sounded sincere. Yet something still felt incomplete. She asked the question she had carried inside her heart for years. "Are you proud of what I've accomplished?" Her father hesitated. Then she asked the second question. "Or are you proud of who I am?" The silence that followed gave her the answer. He loved the surgeon, the award winner, the respected expert, the successful daughter. But he still struggled to understand the person beneath those achievements. The daughter who would have been worthy of love even without the awards. Even without the recognition. Even without the success. Emily smiled sadly. Not because she was angry. Because she finally understood. Some people never learn how to separate a person's value from their accomplishments. And perhaps her father never would. But that realization no longer hurt the way it once had. Because she no longer needed his approval. Years earlier, she believed her family's acceptance would determine her worth. Now she knew better. Worth wasn't something other people gave you. It wasn't measured in money. It wasn't measured in titles. It wasn't measured in status. And it certainly wasn't measured by how impressed other people were. Worth came from character, from compassion, from integrity, from the lives you touched, from the person you chose to be when nobody was watching. That night, Emily returned home to her apartment in Queens. The same apartment her family once mocked. The same apartment they believed represented failure. She sat by the window with a cup of tea and looked out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed with messages. One from Sarah. One from Catherine. One from Charlie's parents sharing a photo of him playing soccer. Each message came from people who valued her for who she was. Not what she owned. Not who she knew. Not what she could do for them. Simply who she was. And in that moment, Emily realized something beautiful. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is the people who stand beside you when they have nothing to gain. The people who celebrate your successes without envy. The people who support you without conditions. The people who love you without requiring you to prove your worth. For years, Emily had searched for acceptance in the wrong place. Now she had finally found something much better. Peace. And with that, peace came a truth powerful enough to change her life forever. Her worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. It never had. And it never would. For the first time in her life, Emily truly understood that. And that understanding was worth more than every award, every title, and every achievement she would ever receive.